Jennifer Grey spent weeks hiding something on the set of one of the most celebrated romantic films in American cinema history. Something she carried in silence through every dance rehearsal, every tight close-up, and every take of the scenes that audiences would later call the most electric chemistry of the decade. When she finally spoke about it publicly, the word she chose to describe Patrick Swayze's behavior toward her during filming wasn't difficult or frustrating or any of the careful, diplomatic language that actors usually reach for when talking about complicated co-stars. She called it disgusting. That word lands differently when you understand where these two people had come from together, what happened between them on a completely different film set 3 years earlier, and what it actually cost them both to get Dirty Dancing finished at all. Most people know the surface version of this story. The film came out in August of 1987, with no major stars, a tight budget, and zero expectations from anyone at the studio. It went on to gross over $214 million worldwide, launch one of the best-selling film soundtracks in Hollywood history, and deliver an Academy Award for Best Original Song. I've Had the Time of My Life became one of the most instantly recognizable tracks in pop music, played at weddings and graduations and school dances for decades after its release. Patrick Swayze became one of the most bankable names in American cinema, going on to headline Ghost and Point Break. Jennifer Grey became an icon, the girl in the corner who nobody expected to change everything the moment she stepped onto a dance floor. But the real story, the one living underneath every frame of that film, is messier and more painful, and honestly far more interesting than anything the screenplay contained. It started years before a single camera rolled on Dirty Dancing, on the set of a very different kind of picture. In 1984, Swayze and Grey both appeared in Red Dawn, a Cold War action film about American high school students who organize as guerrilla fighters after a Soviet invasion. Swayze played the hard-edged leader, and he approached that role the way he approached everything at that stage of his career, with complete intensity and very little patience for anyone operating on a different frequency. He had come to acting through ballet, having trained as a classical dancer and former gymnast before crossing into film, and that background had given him a physical discipline most actors simply didn't carry into a room. Between takes, he stayed in character. On set, he drove scenes with a controlling energy that left almost no breathing room for the people around him. He was known for pranks and off-script behavior, but only on his own terms, and his humor rarely translated for anyone who wasn't already on his wavelength. Grey was working from a completely different place. Her approach was instinct-driven, emotionally open, and spontaneous in ways that Swayze found difficult to work alongside. She found his behavior overbearing, and at times genuinely intimidating. His pranks didn't land for her. His habit of staying in character between setups made the environment feel closed and suffocating. By the time Red Dawn wrapped in New Mexico, Grey had made a quiet decision. She never wanted to be on another set with him again. None of that mattered when the casting team for Dirty Dancing started making their calls. They needed someone with charm, real physical presence, and genuine dance experience to play Johnny Castle. Swayze's name was the obvious answer, even with the history behind it. When Grey found out he was being considered, she told the producers plainly that she wasn't comfortable with the idea. She remembered Red Dawn. She remembered the feeling of walking on eggshells through an entire production, never knowing what mood he'd arrive in or whether he'd take her seriously. But before any decision could be finalized, Swayze found her and pulled her aside, and what he said stopped her cold. His voice cracked. He told her he loved her, and that he was sorry, and that he understood she didn't want him anywhere near this film. And then he said, "We could kill it. We could kill it if we did this." Grey later described seeing something in him that day she'd never seen on that New Mexico set, a real and unguarded vulnerability that didn't belong to the overbearing performer she remembered. Against every instinct she had, she agreed to a screen test. What happened in that screen test is the reason Dirty Dancing exists the way it does. The tension between them, the quality that made the producers lean forward, wasn't manufactured or coaxed out of two polished professionals going through the motions. It came directly from everything unresolved between them. Her openness and his intensity collided on camera in a way that felt charged and alive, and the producers knew immediately they had found their leads. The roles were theirs. But a great screen test doesn't erase years of friction between two people. And once the cameras started rolling for real, everything buried in that history started pushing back to the surface. Production moved to Lake Lure in North Carolina, and the filming conditions pushed everyone toward their limits from almost the first day. The summer heat was relentless. The budget allowed almost no room for costly errors, and the shooting schedule was tight enough that any significant delay sent ripples through the entire production. Swayze injured his knee during filming, and the schedule had to be repeatedly restructured around his recovery. Gray was managing the demands of the lead role, while carrying the emotional weight of her complicated history with her co-star and real, private anxiety about the material itself. She had no formal dance background or choreography training, while Swayze had spent years in professional ballet before ever stepping in front of a camera. That gap showed up in rehearsals, every single day, and it created a tension that was just as real as anything scripted. Scene after scene required multiple retakes because Gray couldn't hold her composure at the moments the choreography demanded precision. She broke into nervous laughter during setups that called for romantic stillness or genuine tension, and Swayze's patience eroded steadily. His standard was repetition and discipline, the kind built through years of formal training, where mistakes get corrected immediately and the work doesn't stop until the execution is clean. Her instinct was to feel her way through a scene rather than hit marks on command. For a trained dancer operating under a compressed schedule, that combination was genuinely maddening. Crew members described moments between setups where the two leads were barely exchanging words, each holding back whatever they were feeling, just long enough for director Emile Ardolino to call action, and then channeling all of it directly into the scene. Ardolino worked from a philosophy of improvisation, and kept his cameras rolling even when the scene drifted away from the script. One particular setup turned into an unplanned moment that ended up defining the film. A scene where Swayze was meant to trail his fingers slowly down Gray's arm, a quiet and deliberate gesture meant to carry real romantic weight, became take after take of Gray dissolving into laughter she couldn't control, while Swayze's expression shifted from focused to visibly annoyed. Ardolino looked at the footage and decided the moment worked exactly as it had unfolded. Both the laughter and Swayze's irritation stayed in the final cut. What audiences read as playful, nervous chemistry was one actress losing control of her composure, and one actor struggling not to show how frustrated he had become. That scene was hard, but the filming of the Hungry Eyes montage was where things reached an actual breaking point between them. The sequence is set to Eric Carmen's song, and follows Baby and Johnny through early rehearsals as their connection slowly builds, shy glances giving way to physical closeness and growing heat. Audiences remember it as one of the warmer, more romantic passages in the film. What was happening on set during those days of shooting was far from warm. By that stage of the production, Swayze's frustration with Gray had shifted into something colder and harder. He muttered between takes. He rolled his eyes at missed cues. Crew members reported that he walked off set at least once and had to be talked back onto it. During the scenes that required the two of them to be physically close together, Gray felt something in the way he looked at her that had nothing to do with the scene or the choreography. She described it years later as a look of disgust, not the slow and smoldering gaze the camera was meant to be capturing, but something that landed on her as open condescension and resentment. She felt belittled, she felt erased, and she said nothing, because speaking up risked being labeled difficult on a production already stretched past its limits in every direction. She carried it through every take of that montage without a word. It took decades before she used the language she'd wanted to use at the time. He was so cold, she said. He was disgusting. Writer Eleanor Bergstein and Ardolino stepped in before the production fell apart. They sat Swayze and Gray down and made them watch their original screen test together. The footage from the day the spark between them had been impossible to deny. The intervention worked. Something in watching that earlier version of themselves reminded both of them why they had agreed to do this at all, and they returned to the remaining material with enough renewed energy to push through to the end, including the moment that would define both of their careers long after everything else had faded. The final lift, where Baby sprints across the floor and Johnny raises her overhead in one clean motion, was captured in a single take. Gray had refused to rehearse it. She was afraid of being dropped, and Swayze's perfectionism could not move her past that fear, no matter how much he pushed. He found it maddening, given everything he believed about preparation and discipline. But when the camera rolled, the adrenaline and the months of unresolved tension produced something on screen that looked effortless and inevitable. One take, no rehearsal, and it became one of the most recreated moments in the history of romantic cinema and dance films. When Dirty Dancing opened in August of 1987, it quietly became something nobody had planned for. Word spread fast, audiences returned again and again, and a film made with almost nothing turned into a phenomenon that grossed over $214 million, pushed its soundtrack to multi-platinum sales figures, and brought home the Academy Award and a Golden Globe to go with it. The two people at the center of it, who had spent large portions of the shoot barely able to hold a civil conversation between setups, became one of the most beloved screen couples Hollywood had ever produced. Gray later said that processing the film's success was complicated, and that separating the pride from the pain took longer than most people would expect. But she came to understand that the rawness on screen was precisely what made audiences connect with it so deeply. Baby's nervousness wasn't always a performance. The tension between the two characters wasn't always pulled from the script. Something genuine was happening in those scenes, and audiences could feel it without knowing what it was, and that is what kept them coming back. Time changed what existed between Swayze and Gray. In 2004, they appeared together for a Dirty Dancing documentary and reflected on their shared history, with something closer to actual understanding than bitterness. Gray spoke with genuine respect for Swayze's dedication and talent. Swayze praised what he called her emotional vulnerability and the growth she had shown through the production, and he suggested, carefully, that he had probably been too hard on her during filming. When Swayze was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, Gray reached out privately. After his passing in 2009, she described him as a rare and beautiful person, complicated but kind. The word disgusting, the one she had reached for when the wound was still close to the surface, had given way to something more complete and honest about who he actually was and what they had managed to build together under that kind of pressure. Dirty Dancing approaches its 40th year in 2027, and it still plays. It still moves people. The legacy of that film lives entirely in its emotional truth, in the way everything on screen feels genuine because it was, though never quite in the way the audience imagines. Behind the romance was real discomfort. Behind the chemistry was real conflict. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, two people who genuinely struggled to share a set made something that has outlasted almost everything else either of them ever touched.